Welcome back, guys, to Whisper of Road. In today's episode, I'm sharing 10 true disturbing stories about abandoned cabins in Appalachia. Each story reveals how the old woods and forgotten homes can blur the line between reality and something far darker. But before we begin, please consider subscribing and don't forget to like and share it with your friends. Let me know where you're watching from. Thank you all. Now, let's start. Story 1. The unexpected detour into Black Saddle Hollow. The narrator's presence on that remote mountain road was solely due to a commitment to Lena, who required a favor. Lena's cousin, a reserved young woman in her early 20s named Callie, needed transportation deep into the hills to visit relatives. As Lena was unable to provide the ride herself, she had requested the narrator's assistance, assuring him it would be a swift task, a mere drop-off near a locality known as Harland, after which he could proceed on his journey. The narrator later reflected that he should have inquired further at that point. He was operating his uncle's venerable Jeep Cherokee, a distinctively boxy model from the 90s, which conveyed an impression of being robust enough to endure a minor conflict. The vehicle's engine emitted a grinding noise, reminiscent of chewing rocks. Its air conditioning system had been non-functional since before the advent of mobile phones. The temperature gauge would engage in a peculiar oscillation whenever he ascended an incline, as if attempting to issue a warning without being overtly alarming. The narrator reasoned that by maintaining a moderate speed, adhering to the main thoroughfares, and refraining from aggravating the vehicle, their trip would proceed without incident. Callie traveled with only a modest duffel bag. She carried no rolling luggage, no mobile phone charger, and not even a water bottle. She was not inclined to conversation, merely acknowledging his greeting with a nod and fixing her gaze out the window, appearing to be mentally distant. Her quiet demeanor did not register as awkward. Rather, it conveyed a sense of watchfulness, as though she were meticulously observing and cataloging details, but felt no compulsion to verbalize her observations. When asked about their destination, Callie responded with composure, as if merely placing an order for a beverage. "Just past Redbird," she stated. "There's a road near a place called Black Saddle Hollow." This was the full extent of the information she provided, offering no indication of the journey's duration or what to anticipate, only that it was August in Kentucky, a time when the atmosphere is oppressively thick and humid, like being encased in damp wool within a sauna. The narrator had lowered the windows, seeking a refreshing current of air, but the air remained dense and clinging. The wind carried the scent of pine, lingering rain, and occasionally an unidentifiable musty aroma. For approximately 2 hours the drive was uneventful, albeit slow and characterized by numerous curves, yet manageable. Subsequently, the Cherokee began to exhibit malfunctions. The temperature gauge ascended precipitously. A sharp, metallic scent became discernible, followed by a distinct hiss emanating from beneath the hood. This was not the sound of brakes or a tire. It was a hiss of an entirely different, ominous nature. Easing off the accelerator, the narrator murmured primarily to the dashboard, "We're overheating." Callie remained impassive. "There's an old stop up ahead. Used to be a cabin store," she informed him. Of course, she possessed this knowledge. He proceeded according to her instructions, turning past a decaying sign, its letters obscured by moss and peeling paint, which designated the location as Black Saddle Hollow. The thoroughfare diminished into a gravel track, then into what seemed like a rudimentary deer trail that a desperate truck had once forged. Each turn in the road appeared precarious, as if poised to precipitate them off the side. They eventually entered a clearing encompassed by tall, unnervingly quiet trees. Approximately 7 or 8 cabins were dispersed throughout the area, most in a state of disrepair and subsidence. resembling survivors of a major natural disaster such as a flood or fire. One cabin, however, stood predominantly upright, though it leaned as if afflicted by a severe back ailment. In the center of the clearing, an antique water pump, rusted and skeletal, presented itself more as a sepulchral marker than a functional instrument. The narrator parked the vehicle, preparing to open the hood, and instructed, "Let's stay near the car." Yet Callie had already exited the vehicle, a cigarette in hand, as though this sequence of events were an ordinary Tuesday. Steam billowed from the engine. The radiator was entirely devoid of fluid. A hose had ruptured along its side, ejecting coolant onto the ground like a burst of antifreeze confetti. He possessed tools but no replacement parts, and zero mobile phone signal, not even a faint flicker sufficient for a failed text message. He pondered the possibility of finding residence in the upright cabin, perhaps a landline telephone. He ascended the porch, the boards groaning audibly beneath his weight. The screen door dangled precariously from a single hinge, emitting a persistent creaking sound. He knocked and called out, receiving no response. The interior exuded the smell of mildew and antiquated newspapers. Furniture remained within, a table adorned with dust-laden plates and a couch, deeply depressed in the middle, suggesting decades of occupation by someone who had watched a now-absent television. The cabin did not appear to have been plundered. Rather, it seemed to have been frozen in time, as though its occupants had departed mid-meal and never returned. Upon returning outside, the narrator observed a man. He stood at the perimeter of the woods, motionless, arms folded, body still. He wore a faded plaid shirt, jeans stained at the knees, and boots partially obscured by undergrowth. His beard was gray and unkempt, as if he had attempted to shave once with a blunt blade and subsequently abandoned the effort. What remained most vivid in the narrator's memory were his eyes, which did not blink with sufficient frequency. "Car trouble?" the man inquired. His voice was devoid of emotion, neither friendly nor unfriendly, simply neutral. "Yeah," the narrator replied, wiping perspiration from his temple. "Hose blew out. We're stuck unless I can find a ride." The man did not approach. He merely indicated down the road with a thumb. "Ain't nothing out here. Closest place for parts is Hazard. Maybe an hour and a half," he stated. The narrator inquired if anyone nearby possessed a phone, a garage, or any assistance. The man shook his head once. "Y'all are the first ones I've seen in weeks," he added. At that juncture, a low rumble ascended the gravel road. A blue Dodge truck entered the clearing, its engine excessively loud for the confined space. The driver was a thick-shouldered man in his mid-50s with a hunting knife conspicuously clipped to his belt, as though it were an inherent part of his attire. His boots landed heavily on the gravel. "Everything all right?" he asked, his smile suggesting a sense of ownership over the driveway. He and the old man exchanged a few murmured words. Subsequently, he turned to the narrator, introducing himself as Tuck. He offered them a ride, claiming he was heading toward town anyway, asserting it was no trouble. He also purported to know an establishment for parts, a new hose, coolant, perhaps even a fan belt. The narrator offered him 40 monetary units for fuel, and 60 if he would transport them near the store. Tuck dismissed the offer, saying, "Save your money. Just being neighborly." The narrator glanced at Callie, who appeared completely unfazed. Her lack of hesitation rendered it more difficult to decline, despite his innate sense of unease. He entered the truck. The cabin interior smelled of cigarettes, gasoline, and an earthy odor, possibly old leather or damp leaves. They drove for nearly an hour, along roads that grew progressively narrower, darker, and more dilapidated with each passing mile. Tuck engaged in extensive conversation about hunting, about ancient cabins perched on the ridges, and about unusual phenomena people once reported seeing in those areas. His tone indicated that he was not jesting, yet he seemed indifferent to whether his stories were believed, a characteristic that only amplified the unsettling nature of his tales. They ultimately arrived at a white dwelling situated near a dry creek bed. Callie turned to the narrator, stating, "They'll want to thank you," as though the decision had already been made. Inside, her parents appeared to be individuals who still maintained a landline telephone and plastic runners on their floor coverings. They were courteous but reserved. Her father presented the narrator with an envelope. "She was safe," he remarked. "That matters." Back in the truck, the narrator opened the envelope, discovering over 300 monetary units within. He informed Tuck of the amount. Tuck emitted a laugh, though his facial expression did not align with the sound. "Guess you made a good impression," he commented. They paused at a roadside general store. The narrator purchased the largest sodas available for both of them. Tuck selected grape. The narrator handed it over, endeavoring to suppress thoughts of the considerable distance still separating him from his Jeep. Tuck raised his drink in a facetious toast. "Let's hit your part." However, instead of proceeding toward the main highway, he diverted onto a dirt path bordered by black pine trees, a narrow, rough, and unnervingly quiet route. "Thought we were headed to Hazard?" the narrator inquired. "This cuts through," Tuck replied. "Quicker." They traveled for 10 minutes. There were no signs, no other vehicles, only the truck, the trees, and the silent spaces between them. Then, with extreme nonchalance, Tuck posed a question. "How much exactly did they give you?" The narrator attempted to maintain a light tone. "More than I expected." "Guess they were thankful." At that instant, Tuck slammed on the brakes. His arm swiftly and tightly wrapped around the narrator's neck, a blunt strangulation that instantly cut off all sensation. "Give me the damn money," Tuck barked. "I'll kill you right here." The narrator reacted without thought. He seized the soda he had bought for Tuck and forcefully jammed it into his face. The lid detached. Ice and the grape-flavored carbonated beverage erupted. Tuck sputtered, his grip loosening just sufficiently. The narrator twisted the door handle and fell out of the truck. He landed hard in the dirt, rolled, regained his footing, and commenced running. Branches tore at his shirt and slapped his face. He stumbled but persevered. He did not halt until he crashed through a fence and into someone's backyard. A man tending a garden hose stared at him as if he were an apparition. "Water," the narrator gasped. "Please, someone tried to kill me." The man disappeared into his garage and returned with a bottle of water. The narrator emptied it. He recounted the entire ordeal to them. The man gestured toward a rotary telephone affixed to the wall. The narrator contacted his family, informing them of the incident. They reassured him that he was safe and that they were already en route to retrieve him. Upon their arrival, the narrator requested a stop at an auto parts store. He procured a new hose, clamps, coolant, and all necessary items. His family then dropped him off at a Trans-Mountain Coachways terminal a few towns away. He traveled south on a coach. He disembarked near Barberville. Although still a considerable trek, it was nearer his destination. He walked for several hours, eventually locating a diner adjacent to a truck stop. He sat down and ordered the most economical sandwich on the menu. A man seated at the counter, characterized by heavy-rimmed spectacles, leaned toward him. "You look like hell," he observed. The narrator recounted his entire story. The man listened without a flicker of expression, merely nodding. "I'm heading that way," he offered. I can take you, not in any rush." His name was Benny. He identified himself as a former Marine, stating that his knees were now compromised, but his truck remained operational. Benny delivered him near the cabins. The narrator set to work. He turned the Jeep around, drove onto the gravel, and continued without stopping until the asphalt surface became visible. Story 2. The enigmatic relocating cabin. My work period at Ridgecrest Gearhouse concluded earlier than usual that particular Thursday. Such an occurrence was exceedingly rare. I distinctly recall checking the time twice to confirm that the clock was indeed functioning. A significant portion of daylight still remained, so instead of following my customary route along the main thoroughfare, I opted for a shortcut through the woods. This shortcut is known to most local residents. It commences directly behind an antiquated trail marker near the rear parking area. It is neither indicated on any official maps, nor would it ever pass a safety inspection, yet it effectively reduces the walking time home by nearly an hour. I have traversed this path an countless number of times. The path itself is narrow, etched into the ground like a deer trail, meanders past minor watercourses and old birch stumps. A few branches extend low enough to brush one's head if attention is not maintained. However, on that specific evening, these minor inconveniences were not a concern. I had navigated this path in conditions of significantly poorer visibility. Residents of the town are prone to gossip, particularly those who have resided there for generations. They will recount tales of unusual occurrences within those woods, primarily involving disappearances. Accounts tell of families in the hill country who allegedly simply ceased to exist one day. Cabins were purportedly left behind, with meals still on tables and beds unmade, as if the occupants had momentarily stepped out for something and never subsequently returned. I had never given much credence to these narratives, dismissing them as mere campfire lore. Initially, the situation unfolded normally. I had my earphones in, the volume set low, with one earbud in and one out. I could hear the sound of my footsteps and the rustling of my jacket. The trail was quiet, as it invariably was. Approximately 20 minutes into my walk, I observed something peculiar. To my right, barely discernible between two towering spruces, stood a cabin. I had previously encountered collapsed shelters and antiquated hunting blinds in this area, but this structure was distinct. This one possessed a definite framework, 4 sturdy walls, and a roof that, while slightly bowed, remained largely intact. There was a porch, and tucked precisely into one corner of that porch was a rocking chair. I ceased my progression and gazed intently. It wasn't overtly unsettling, merely anomalous. There was no encroaching vegetation, no accumulation of debris on the steps. The boards did not appear discolored by rain or decay. They were clean, indeed seemingly swept. However, there were no indications of habitation. No footwear by the entrance, no equipment suspended from the railing, no column of smoke ascending from the chimney. Just a spotless, diminutive dwelling concealed deep within the forest, appearing entirely out of place. I speculated that perhaps someone had tidied it up, possibly a hunter restoring it, or a squatter residing there, as such occurrences sometimes transpired. Consequently, I resumed my walk. The trail gently curved to the left, as it consistently does after the second stream crossing. I gave it no further thought. However, then, on my left, it reappeared. The identical bent chimney, the same fractured panel in the door, the very same rocking chair, precisely identical. I halted abruptly, frozen in place. It defied logic. I had been moving forward. The trail does not form a loop, and I was certain I had not retraced my steps. My legs began to move instinctively, faster this time. I convinced myself I was experiencing an illusion. Perhaps there were 2 identical cabins in these woods. Perhaps I had not noticed it from that particular angle before. I even increased the volume of my music slightly to dampen my growing apprehension. But 10 minutes later, it materialized again. This time, it was directly ahead, positioned squarely in the center of the path, as if the surrounding woods had reconfigured themselves around it, and something fundamental had altered. The rocking chair was no longer in its previous location. It was angled, subtly turned toward the door, suggesting that someone had just vacated it or brushed past it. It was then that I experienced it. Not precisely fear, but rather a pervasive pressure, akin to a heavy mass pressing directly behind my ribs. I instinctively reached for my mobile phone. There was no signal, not even a fleeting indication of connectivity. I pivoted, intending to retrace my route, but the path behind me appeared incorrect. It was not merely the angle. The entire topographical arrangement seemed altered. The trail did not typically twist in such a manner, and nestled within that convoluted section, precisely where I had just walked, was the cabin. Again, I was not merely walking in circles. I was navigating through a space that refused to remain static. I stared for an excessive duration. Then I turned and accelerated my pace. My objective was no longer to comprehend the phenomenon. I simply desired to escape. My boots struck the ground with more force than necessary. I was indifferent. Yet, regardless of the distance I traversed, the trail failed to extend. Everything felt unnervingly close. The trees subtly inclined inward, as though observing me, and then I looked up. The cabin was once more ahead, but on this occasion, it presented differently. It was directly on the path, dead center, not adjacent to it, not near it, but positioned squarely upon it. The trail led straight to its porch, and its door stood open, completely ajar. The interior was not merely shadowy or dim. It was solid black, like gazing into an abyss utterly devoid of depth. It was the kind of profound darkness that causes the brain to falter, incapable of processing what it perceives. I spun around with the intention to flee, but there was no discernible trail, only trees, silent, identical, densely packed in every direction, as if the path had been entirely effaced. My mouth became parched. Then a single creaking sound, a floorboard shifting. I looked back. The rocking chair tilted minutely, then settled. Nothing had physically contacted it. I was reluctant to move forward, but I realized I had already done so. Somehow, inadvertently, I had stepped off the trail. The ground beneath me was no longer the same. It was soft, pale, powdery. I crouched for a closer inspection. Dust, gray, fine, and dry. I was no longer on the trail. I was standing in a yard. My heart pounded against my ribcage with such intensity that my vision pulsed. I retreated step by methodical step until my back made contact with something solid, a tree, and just as suddenly, the surrounding woods underwent a transformation. The cabin vanished. The trail reappeared, pristine and uncomplicated, as if nothing untoward had transpired. I did not attempt to question it. I simply fled. Branches clawed at me, slapped my face and shoulders, tearing at my sleeves. I nearly sprained my ankle twice. My lungs felt as though they were being compressed. Everything about the woods felt profoundly wrong. The path seemed to stretch in an unnatural manner. Turns I did not recall, gaps that did not correspond to its expected layout. But finally, I discerned it. A strip of gravel, the road. I burst through the trees, stumbled into the ditch, clambered out, and collapsed onto the pavement. Asphalt had never appeared so reassuring. I remained seated there for what seemed like hours, hunched over, gasping, my fingers pressed against my knees. My arm was trembling so severely that I was unable to retrieve my mobile phone from my pocket. Story 3. The Counting Cabins and the Hidden Presence. Cal and I were seated on his porch one evening after an extended period of hiking. We were concluding a six-pack of beverages and exchanging various anecdotes. Cal was the sort of individual replete with intriguing local lore, such as the historical accounts of defunct mining settlements or locations where ancient railway lines have been reclaimed by the wilderness. On that particular night, he recounted information about several cabins situated deep within the Jalen Ridge area. This region extends beyond Lake Redfield, reaching into a type of dense, unmarked woodland that people either meticulously avoid or approach with extreme caution when venturing into it. He indicated that these cabins were vestiges of bygone logging operations, potentially dating back to the early 1900s or even earlier. No official paths lead to them. There are no directional signs and no oversight from any parks department. Access is solely via word-of-mouth instructions among hunters and a few solitary individuals who favor off-trail excursions. "They're still standing," he remarked, opening another beer, "but they don't feel empty." That particular phrase resonated deeply. He did not utter it with the intention of frightening me. He simply stated it, flatly, like a premeditated warning. The statement lingered with me for several weeks. I found myself unable to dismiss it. I began consulting antiquated forestry maps, cross-referencing topographical data, and perusing online forums and message boards for any mention of forgotten structures within the ridges. Scarcely any information surfaced, merely whispers and a couple of indistinct photographs. This scarcity, paradoxically, intensified my conviction. The less evidence I discovered, the more I believed the accounts. Consequently, one Wednesday, I prepared a bag for a weekend trip. I had printed a map annotated with a rudimentary set of directions provided by Cal and set out. I left my vehicle in a gravel pull-off several miles beyond the last designated trailhead. No other individuals were present, no vehicles, no hikers, only the melodic chirping of birds and the intermittent rustling of the breeze through the overhead canopy. The initial phase of the hike felt conventional. It involved a complex network of deer trails and desiccated stream beds. My mobile phone ceased to receive reception approximately 45 minutes into the journey, which was anticipated. I was equipped with my compass, my printed map, supplementary batteries, and all the customary gear. However, as I ventured deeper, the woods began to evoke an increasingly peculiar sensation, not precisely ominous, but rather devoid of character. There were no clearings, no audible sounds of flowing water, and no birds once I had progressed sufficiently far. The terrain sloped unpredictably, with ridge lines folding inward upon themselves like overlapping undulations. The undergrowth was dense in certain areas, necessitating detours or crawling. After a couple of hours, just as I commenced to question if I had misinterpreted Cal's instructions or if the entire endeavor was merely an elaborate jest, I sighted the first cabin. It leaned heavily into a gradient, as if the hillside had gradually sought to engulf it over the years. One wall had entirely collapsed. There was no door, only a disproportionate frame. The roof was torn open at the rear, exposing substantial wooden beams that were reminiscent of cracked and splayed ribs. The interior was, as one might anticipate, remnants of furniture barely distinguishable, a rusted bed frame distorted by age, and tree roots intertwining through the floorboards like vascular structures. I captured a photograph out of routine. It contained no particularly useful information, but it served as a form of validation for my presence there. I continued moving. The second cabin was not far, perhaps 100 yards downhill, partially obscured by a dense mountain laurel. This structure appeared more intact, weathered and gray, yet structurally sound. Its windows were merely apertures, yet the frame stood tall. I stepped inside and immediately paused. There were boots. They were arranged along the far wall, lined up as if someone had deliberately placed them there, not as worn leather relics. These were hiking boots, relatively recent, clean, with their laces neatly tucked inside. I crouched and gently ran my hand across one. They were dry, free of dust, and their soles exhibited minimal wear. They did not belong in such a desolate location. I remained standing for an extended period, my heart thudding with unwarranted intensity, attempting to formulate a logical explanation. Perhaps someone had abandoned them, after utilizing the cabin as a temporary resting place. But then, why would they be arranged so meticulously? Why leave them at all? The entire scene evoked a sense of being deliberately arranged, not necessarily for my benefit, but intentionally orchestrated. Outside, the forest had fallen silent, not the customary stillness resulting from startled birds. This was a flat, pressurized quietude, as if the volume of the world had been attenuated. I retreated slowly, each footstep more consciously perceived than I desired. The trees no longer felt vacant. The third cabin was situated higher up the ridge. It occupied a sunlit patch where the trees parted just enough to create an unnatural-feeling space, a clearing that seemed misplaced. This cabin possessed a door that was closed and latched, its hinges rusted but still functional. I hesitated before pushing it open, half expecting something to be awaiting me behind it. The room was mostly devoid of contents. No bed, no broken furniture, just a solitary chair. It was positioned precisely in the center of the room, upright, perfectly aligned, facing the opposing wall. I paused at the threshold, then stepped inside, drawn involuntarily toward the wall. It was then that I observed the carvings, rows of tally marks, 5 lines intersected by a 6th, deeply incised into the wooden planks. Not merely 1 or 2 rows, but dozens. I involuntarily counted them, 34. Each mark was sharp and recent, showing no signs of weathering or dust within the grooves. Someone had recently been present here, not years ago, but days ago, perhaps even hours. The air within felt aberrant, as if it resisted being inhaled. I swiftly retreated, my eyes scanning every corner, despite the absence of any conceivable hiding place. My skin was tingling. I resolved to inspect the final cabin purely to confirm I had observed them all. Then I would commence my return journey. The 4th cabin proved more challenging to access. It was situated further up the ridge, obscured by a steep incline and a dense entanglement of undergrowth. I perceived it before I reached it, and an immediate sense of something being amiss permeated the air. The windows were covered, not broken or missing, but covered. Shutters were secured with nails from the interior. The same applied to the door. Thick planks had been hammered across it, as if someone had fortified themselves inside or sought to repel an external entity. However, near the lower corner of the door, one board had fractured, leaving a jagged opening approximately the size of my fist. I am unsure what compelled me, but I crouched down and peered through the aperture. What I witnessed did not correspond with the other cabins. The interior was almost clean, not pristine, but maintained. A mattress rested on the floor, worn but intact. Beside it, a small table held a lantern. The lantern gleamed. It was devoid of dust or rust, polished and cared for, as if someone had recently used it or was preparing to. Then I apprehended the sound. A dragging step, slow and deliberate, the wood groaning under its weight. I froze. Another step, closer to the wall, closer to the narrow gap where I was crouched. I could not visually detect any movement, but I distinctly felt it. The air perceptibly shifted in synchronicity with the sound. My breath caught in my throat. My heart violently slammed against my ribs. Stillness descended. I staggered backward, stumbling over roots as I propelled myself away from the cabin. I made no attempt to be quiet. I was indifferent to whether anything might hear me. I plunged directly down the ridge, abandoning the indistinct trail. Thorns tore at my arms. My backpack snagged on brambles, abruptly yanking me sideways. I did not cease my flight, not until I breached the tree line and caught sight of the flash of sunlight reflecting off my vehicle's windshield. I did not once glance behind me. I entered the car, forcefully closed the door, and drove until I reached a filling station with mobile phone reception. Even then, I could not bring myself to open my camera roll and inspect the photograph captured from the first cabin. I experienced very little sleep that night. I was unable to dislodge the thoughts of the boots, the engraved tally marks, and the sound of that dragging step from behind the barricaded door. I have not returned to that location, and I contemplate whether my observations were merely what someone desired me to perceive. Story 4. The Relentless Return of the Ceramic Mug. My Uncle Jameson presented me with a couple of hundred monetary units to journey into the Black Ridge Mountains and inspect several antiquated cabins he possessed. These were cabins he had not visited in many years. He specified that my only duty was to navigate the dusty, narrow road, barely accommodating my truck, to peer inside each structure and to confirm that no one had taken up residence, that no trees had penetrated the roofs, and that no squatters or other anomalous situations were present. Easy money, he had assured me. His description made it sound as uncomplicated as completing a bureaucratic form. That simplicity was my primary motivation for agreeing. I required the financial compensation, and frankly, it seemed more appealing than spending the entire weekend in my modest apartment. With a cup of coffee in one hand and half a bag of chips on the passenger seat, I dismissed any apprehension of the unusual and set my truck's course northward. The initial cabin leaned at an extreme angle, appearing to be engaged in a losing battle against the force of gravity. Half of its porch had crumbled into a tangle of weeds, rendering it less like a former dwelling and more like a decaying memory. The door emitted a groan as it opened. Inside, I observed broken chairs, droppings from raccoons, damp sections spreading across the floor, and a stale, unidentifiable odor of mold. I captured a few photographs for Jameson and then proceeded. There was nothing within that elicited more than a grimace. The second location was almost identical, distinguished only by its unique manifestation of ruin. A cast iron stove lay shattered as if struck by a powerful whirlwind. The floorboards flexed perilously, suggesting they might collapse and plunge me directly into the earth if I remained stationary for too long. I circumvented a decaying plank, making mental notations. The roof was sagging. The floor's structural integrity was questionable, rendering it uninhabitable. My back muscles were already tensed. I was contemplating the comfort of removing my boots upon my return home. By then, my thoughts had drifted to dinner plans, perhaps a new science fiction program or a call to my younger sister. I am unsure why I persisted, but I did. The third cabin materialized through the trees as if it had been patiently awaiting my arrival. It conveyed a distinct impression. The porch steps appeared sturdy. The windows, though aged, were unbroken, and the door was firmly shut, not suspended precariously or gaping open, but closed with apparent care. I rationalized, perhaps someone resides here. Perhaps they will return soon. However, that thought felt fragile, like attempting to confront an oncoming freight train with mere words of reason. I pushed the door open. Inside, the silence was more profound than in the preceding cabins. There was no acrid odor, only dust so pervasive that it seemed to impede the very air I breathed. A solitary table occupied the center of the room. Upon it rested a lantern and a ceramic mug, unadorned and chipped on one side. I leaned closer. A faint brown residue adhered to the bottom, possibly old coffee. It resembled the kind of mug that remains tucked away for years, forgotten in a cupboard. I ran my finger across a nearby shelf. Dust billowed into small clouds. It was that degree of undisturbed antiquity. I straightened up and resolved to swiftly inspect the remainder of the cabin. A cot sagged against the wall, its blanket torn. Rusty cans lined a shelf, corroded with holes. The closet was distended with shredded fabric and nests of mice. No signs of life, no footprints, no indication that anyone had been present in years. I began to articulate the word empty, but when I turned back, the mug was gone. absolute silence descended. No wind, no creaking wood, just an absence of sound. I stared. No mug, not on the table, not on the floor, vanished. My throat tightened. I took one step, then another, my chest constricting. I re-examined the table, looked beneath it. Nothing. Perhaps I was fatigued. Perhaps I had imagined it. But I distinctly recalled the chip on the rim, that slender brown ring. I compelled myself to regulate my breathing, retrieved the clipboard, and inscribed a single word: vacant. Then I exited without a backward glance. The air felt viscous, like glue. People speak of innate intuition, of gut feelings. That night, mine screamed. I walked the mere 20 feet to my truck, repeatedly telling myself, just 20 feet. I opened the door, and there it was on the driver's seat. The same chip, the same circular brown ring. My fingers trembled. The keys slipped from my grasp. I stared at it as if it had miraculously grown limbs. I picked it up gingerly with 2 fingers barely making contact. It felt as though it were electrically charged. I hurled it into the weeds, entered the truck, slammed the doors shut, locked them twice, and did not permit myself to breathe until the gravel road blurred behind me. An hour later, the road constricted into dense forest, my headlights illuminating only the trees ahead. Then the 4th cabin materialized as if it had been patiently awaiting me. The porch came into view, and I abruptly braked. That mug was on the top step, perfectly centered. I swallowed, circumvented it without looking at it, entered the cabin, took my photograph, captured one of the porch from the doorway, and then departed swiftly. No greeting to the mug, no second glance. I climbed into the truck, opened the driver's door, and there it was again. The mug nestled in the cup holder. I did not scream. I simply gripped the steering wheel until the indentations burned into my palm. The road leading out extended endlessly. Each curve appeared identical. The trees pressed in closer. In the rearview mirror, my face was pale, my eyes excessively wide. I eventually reached home. I am uncertain of the speed at which I drove. I parked the vehicle, leaving the engine running. I stared at the mugs in the cup holder. It was not broken. Nothing about it seemed amiss. It appeared to belong there, but the very notion of belonging felt profoundly incorrect. I left it in the truck overnight. I did not bring it inside. I attempted to sleep. Each time I closed my eyes, I envisioned that empty table where it had initially vanished. At dawn, my endurance was depleted. I seized the mug, slammed it against the curb. It shattered into sharp fragments of white and brown. I meticulously gathered every piece, enclosed them in a bag, sealed it with tape, and set out. 20 miles later, I stood on River Fort Bridge, dropped the bag into the frigid water, and observed the current draw it away. It felt conclusive, clean. That evening, I did not approach the truck, leaving it where it was, with leaves rustling around it. I reassured myself, that's the end. I hoped it was. Morning arrived prematurely. Sunlight filtered through the curtains. Birdsong filled the air. Ordinary occurrences. I walked to the living room, gazed out at the driveway, opened the truck door, and there it was, pristine. The same chip, the same brown ring, patiently waiting in the cup holder. I never again accepted a task on that road for Uncle Jameson. Story 5. The Shifting Forest and the Dinner-Ready Cabin. It commenced with a casual discussion I had with a companion over several beverages one evening. Jared is the sort of individual replete with intriguing local lore, such as the historical accounts of defunct mining settlements or locations where ancient railway lines have been reclaimed by the wilderness. On that particular night, he recounted information about certain cabins, truly ancient structures profoundly concealed off a less frequented path in a segment of the Appalachian region, not far from where we both spent our formative years. His description was devoid of dramatic or eerie embellishments. He merely stated that these were places where families once resided, and one by one they either relocated or, in a few instances, simply ceased to appear in town. There was never any official record, just a gradual fading away. I inquired if people still ventured into those areas. He shrugged. "Locals know about them," he stated, "but you won't find them on any map. You really got to know where to look." It sounded like the kind of narrative people relay, a blend of partial truth and exaggeration. Yet something about it persisted in my mind. The concept of structures merely existing out there, untouched, slowly disintegrating into the forest, began to provoke an insistent curiosity, as if I needed to witness them personally. I reasoned that, at worst, I would enjoy a respectable hike and dedicate a day. At best, I would discover some compelling ruins and acquire a story. Consequently, the following Saturday, I prepared my equipment. Just the essentials: water, snacks, a flashlight, a mobile phone with GPS capabilities, a compass, and all other standard gear. I departed early to evade the heat and parked at the trailhead Jared had vaguely delineated. It was a familiar locale. I had previously traversed that section, but on this occasion, I had no intention of adhering to the principal path. The hike initiated normally. The air was cool, still retaining the final vestiges of spring. I maintained a respectable pace. The main trail ascended steadily and was adequately marked, although somewhat rocky in sections, yet nothing overly challenging. After a couple of miles, I reached the turnoff Jared had described. It was not genuinely a trail, but rather a gap between trees, where perhaps long ago sufficient foot traffic had worn down the ground. Now it was mostly overgrown. Nevertheless, I diverged and commenced my ascent. The undergrowth rapidly intensified and the terrain grew steeper. I pressed through the vegetation, engaging in a combination of hiking and scrambling. The trees drew in tighter and the forest began to feel altered, not overtly ominous, but rather sealed off, quieter, as if the entire world had receded behind me and I was venturing deeper into something of greater antiquity. Ultimately, I surmounted a minor ridge, and there it was, the first cabin. It inclined significantly to the left, as though it had been perpetually weary. The roof sagged inward at its center. One corner appeared to have sunken into the ground. Gaps existed in the walls where planks had decayed, yet it still stood. The windows were mere empty rectangular openings. The door hung from a single hinge, swaying faintly. I gently nudged it open. The hinge emitted a soft, fatigued groan. Inside, the light barely penetrated. Dust motes floated thickly in the air. Everything was coated in a fuzzy gray layer. The cabin was largely vacant. A rusted bed frame, a collapsed chair in one corner, and the husk of a wood stove tilted on its side. There was nothing inherently menacing about it, only abandonment, that profound stillness left by the gradual quiet passage of time. I was not afraid. If anything, I was intrigued. I captured a few photographs, circumnavigated its perimeter, and then stepped back outside. Gazing uphill, I discerned another structure, smaller, partially obscured by a stand of trees. It appeared more robust, less deteriorated. I perceived a portion of its roofline, the edge of a wall. Consequently, I advanced toward it. However, upon reaching the designated spot, nothing was present, merely trees. No clearing, no structure, no disturbed ground. I rotated slowly in a circle, bewildered. I retraced my steps downhill, believing I had misjudged the angle. But as I descended, it reappeared, precisely where I had initially observed it, as solid as anything. That marked the initial moment of unease. I ascended again, more rapidly this time, my eyes fixed upon it. I did not avert my gaze, nor did I second-guess myself. But the instant I surmounted the rise, it vanished once more. No cabin, only forest. I turned to locate the first cabin, the one I had already explored, and it too was gone. Gone. That ridge consisted solely of dense thicket, no wood, no opening in the trees, no disturbed ground. It was as if I had merely imagined the entire experience, as if my memory were fallacious. My stomach lurched, and my legs became unsteady. I stepped back, staring at the empty space, endeavoring to comprehend it. I knew what I had witnessed. I was not lost, not truly. I still possessed a compass. I still had my mobile phone, but the signal was tenuous and the GPS readings were erratic, failing to correspond with my perceived location. It was then that I resolved to return. Even if it necessitated an extended period of bushwhacking, I presumed I would eventually intersect the main trail. So I commenced moving in the direction from which I believed I had come. However, every path appeared identical. Every turn led me back to the same cluster of trees. I am convinced I passed the same fallen log 3 distinct times. It felt as though the woods had intricately folded in upon themselves. Still, I continued walking, selected a direction, and adhered to it. It was then that I sighted another cabin, closer this time, and distinct. Its walls were not sagging. The roof was intact. The door was half open, as though someone had momentarily stepped out and left it ajar. I should have retreated, but I did not. I convinced myself that I required a landmark, a point of reorientation, so I advanced toward it. Inside, the light was subdued but sufficiently clear, and this cabin was not empty. A wooden table occupied the center of the room. 4 plates, 4 cups, a complete set of silverware, all meticulously arranged, as if a meal were imminent. A layer of dust covered everything, yet the placement was too clean, too deliberate. The chairs were pulled back slightly, just a few inches, as if occupants had been seated there and simultaneously risen. The hair on my arms bristled. I retreated slowly, my gaze fixed on the table. Then I turned to depart. But the door through which I had entered was no longer present. In its place was a seamless wooden wall. No cracks, no hinges, nothing. My chest tightened. I pressed my palms against the walls, searching for a seam, a handle, anything. The room was small. There were not many places where a door could be concealed. Then I noticed the window. Narrow, rectangular, positioned high in the far wall. I forced it open. The wood resisted, swollen and dry. The latch tore at my wrist as I shoved it wide. I grasped the frame, hauled myself up, and squeezed through, scraping my back and arms. I landed hard on the ground, rolled, regained my breath, and looked back. No cabin, only weeds, tall, undisturbed, swaying as if nothing had ever stood there. I did not pause to contemplate. My legs moved autonomously. I ran. Branches whipped my face and arms. My lungs burned. I was no longer aiming for the trail. I simply desired to escape. And then, through the indistinctness of the trees, I perceived it. The glint of my vehicle's windshield. That reflection of sunlight on glass had never appeared so reassuring in my entire existence. I did not decelerate until I was leaning against the hood of my car. Story 6. The Ouija Table and the Unseen Presence. It began as one of those journeys conceived partly through planning and partly through improvisation. Myself, Luke, Ashton, and a couple of other companions, Ben and Carter, harbored a desire to retreat into the Appalachian Mountains for a period. Our aim was not the customary trails or the readily accessible loops. We sought something more profound, more secluded. We extracted a few sections from antiquated maps, presuming we could construct a longer, quieter route, devoid of mobile phone coverage, park signage, or families equipped with cooler boxes and portable audio devices. By the second day, exhaustion had set in. Blisters were forming, straps were digging into our shoulders, and our provisions were dwindling. We had not encountered another hiker for almost a full day, which was precisely our intention. Nevertheless, such extensive quietude and pervasive greenery can eventually affect one's mental state. one begins to perceive the world as solely trees, hills, and one's own aching limbs. That afternoon, having navigated through a dense entanglement of overgrowth, we inadvertently entered a clearing, and there they were, 4 cabins, ancient and dilapidated, appearing as though they were attempting to recline and merge with the hillside. An immediate sense of wrongness permeated the atmosphere. The cabins were not indicated on any map, not on our printed copies, not on Carter's topographical charts, nor even on Ben's GPS device, which typically registered even the most minor logging tracks. These were not precisely ruins, but they were nearing that state. Roofs sagged inward, shingles were flaking, and walls bowed as if subjected to external pressure from the earth. The front steps of one cabin had completely collapsed, its doorway gaping crookedly like a dislodged tooth. None of us spoke much initially. We were attempting to ascertain whether the discovery was more cool or more creepy, perhaps both. "Moonshiner stuff?" Luke queried, prodding a splintered frame with his boot. "Too far gone," Ashton responded. "They'd have been living in them. These look abandoned for decades." "They're not even marked," Ben mumbled, scrutinizing his GPS device. "How do 4 buildings just disappear off the grid?" Carter indicated the highest cabin. "That one's still standing mostly." We selected it without extensive deliberation. Personally, I wished to continue moving. Frankly, everything about those cabins evoked a visceral sense of apprehension, but the others were disinclined. We were weary. The sun was descending, and that cabin offered the shelter of 4 walls and a roof. It was difficult to contravene such practical considerations. The interior was dusty and arid, conspicuously empty. A chair leaned in one corner as if having resigned. The table was partially collapsed, one leg shorter, causing it to wobble if one applied pressure. A rusted stove occupied the rear, unused for many decades. There were no tools, no cans, no blankets, merely bare floors and silence. I deposited my pack near the wall and crouched by the table, running my hand along its underside instinctively, searching for exposed nails or loose boards. Instead, my fingers scraped against something carved, deep grooves. I lowered myself further to inspect it. The entire alphabet had been etched into the wood, forming 2 neat rows, A through M and N through Z. Above them, faintly and almost effaced by wear, were the words yes and no. This was not random engraving, not initials, not graffiti. It was a Ouija board meticulously carved directly into the table itself. My stomach constricted. I summoned the others. Luke raised an eyebrow. "Well, that's subtle." Ben squinted. "You think someone actually used it?" "Looks like it was made to use," I affirmed. "This wasn't just for fun." Ashton emitted a soft laugh. "What else would they do up here? No TV, no internet, just summon some backwoods ghosts." However, no one genuinely laughed. Even the jest felt strained. That evening we remained outside. Our meal consisted of rice boiled with fragments of jerky in a dented pot. The fire crackled softly. The clearing progressively faded into darkness, and every few minutes my gaze involuntarily returned to the other cabins. Their windows appeared like hollow eye sockets fixed, as if observing us. It was nearing midnight when the incident occurred. 2 distinct, measured knocks. It was not the sound of a falling branch, nor an animal. It was unmistakably the sound of a fist striking wood. We froze. My body tensed before my mind fully registered the event. "What was that?" Ben whispered. Luke had already activated his headlamp, its beam slicing through the trees. It illuminated the furthest cabin, and one of its windows became illuminated. Not a flickering light, not firelight. It was a clear, white luminescence, akin to a fluorescent bulb being switched on behind the glass. It did not match the light of our fire. It did not match our headlamps. It was a light that did not belong. We stared, silent, perhaps 10 seconds. Then the light extinguished. Gone. No flicker, no fade. Simply gone. Someone uttered an expletive. Carter emitted a shaky laugh, but it dissolved before it could fully materialize. No one proposed investigating. No one moved. That night, we feigned sleep in rotations. Every crackle from the fire, every creak of the wood caused my breath to catch. Morning felt surreal. Ben desired to depart, as did I. Carter and Luke engaged in an argument. They suggested it was merely reflected light, perhaps a solar panel. Ashton merely shrugged, silent. We remained. No one wished to separate. That night we sat inside the cabin. No fire, only headlamps suspended from nails. The glow was soft and uneven. Luke occupied the antiquated chair. His pack leaned against its leg. We endeavored to behave normally, attempted to laugh, tried to rationalize the prior events. And then the chair moved. It did not rock. It did not wobble. It slid 2 feet backward across the warped floorboards, dragging the pack with it. Luke shouted and abruptly stood. Ashton inadvertently kicked the wall so forcefully that he knocked over a cup. My hands grew cold. The air remained motionless. Nothing else stirred. We meticulously searched the cabin from top to bottom. No animals, no gaps, no breeze. Shutters were secured with nails. The door was closed. Nothing could have caused that chair to move. I crouched by the table once more, perhaps merely to establish contact with something tangible. It was then that I observed it, below the alphabet. Scratched faintly, shallowly, jaggedly, as if someone had carved it but wished it to remain unnoticed. A single word, stay. My skin crawled. I stared before summoning Luke. He frowned. Was that there yesterday? I didn't see it, I replied, but it was always there. We never again sat at that table. By nightfall, the attempts at humor had ceased. No more pretense. Someone whose identity I cannot recall proposed attempting to use the Ouija board. I emphatically declined. The suggestion was too abrupt, too unnerving. Silence ensued. After that, sometime after 3 a.m., the knocking recommenced. 2 knocks. This time it originated from inside. Luke whispered, "The door." I shook my head. "No, back room." The back room was barely spacious enough to stand within. It had no window, no exit, only decaying shelves and warped boards. Ashton seized his light, opened the door. Nothing, just dust, stale air, a blanket lying on the floor. We left it open thereafter. For the remainder of the night we remained awake, staring at shadows, flinching at every creak, waiting. When the sun finally rose, it felt like a collective hallucination. We packed our belongings within 10 minutes. No conversation, no food, simply an immediate departure. Miles later, silence still prevailed. Not within the car, nor subsequently, but the memory persists for all of us. I have undertaken numerous hikes since that experience, but I have never returned to that particular ridge. Story 7. The Looping Clearing and the Desperate Map. I was 28 years of age when the incident transpired. I had meticulously planned a solitary hiking excursion through a remote segment of the Appalachian backcountry. It was to be just myself, my backpack, and a couple of serene days, 3 at most. The trail I had chosen was a loop that intricately wound through secluded ridges. The nearest signs of civilization, a service station, a paved road, or other individuals, were approximately 20 miles distant. There would be no mobile phone service, no digital updates, no notifications. This was precisely the experience I sought. I was experiencing professional exhaustion and, frankly, had grown weary of people. My preparations were complete. Gear was compactly stowed. I had ample provisions of food and water. My paper map, waterproofed, was marked and folded, exhibiting a distinct crease from frequent use. I double-checked the meteorological conditions before setting out. Clear skies, stable temperatures, no valid reason not to proceed. It was the kind of journey intended to clear one's mind. The initial day unfolded precisely as anticipated. I maintained good time, reached my designated checkpoints, and established camp near a flowing stream. That night, I succumbed to sleep amidst a profound stillness, attainable only far from any infrastructure. It was a quietude so intense that it caused my ears to emit a faint ringing, as if my brain were awaiting an accustomed background noise that never materialized. The second day also began without incident. I awoke early, dismantled my camp, and continued onward. I was progressing ahead of schedule, which felt satisfying. Around midday, the trail meandered along a ridgeline that opened into dense pine forests and precipitous slopes. According to my map, it should have curved eastward and then leveled out. However, upon reaching that specific location, there was not one clear turn. There was a split in the path. One route narrowed into a tangled mass of undergrowth and fallen branches. The other was broader, more worn, suggesting greater foot traffic. I am uncertain whether it was instinct or sheer expediency, but I opted for the wider path. It simply appeared easier to traverse. 10 minutes later, the trees parted into a curious small clearing. That was when I observed them. 5 cabins, irregularly tucked into the hillside, as though they had been haphazardly dropped there, without consideration for spacing. They varied in shape and size, but were constructed from the same weathered wood. They slouched into the earth, partially engulfed by vines. Not a single one was indicated on my map. At first glance, they conveyed an impression of abandonment, perhaps hunting cabins or some forgotten outpost. Moss covered their roofs. Windows were either cracked or absent. Every door appeared to have succumbed in a prolonged struggle with time, yet they were undeniably real. They were not supposed to be there, but they were. I stood there for a considerable duration, simply observing. Initially, I was not even perturbed. I was merely curious. Such places sometimes emerge, peculiar remnants from earlier eras. Consequently, I approached closer. The first cabin lacked a door, possessing only a frame where hinges had once been. The floor inside sagged deeply at its center, gradually collapsing over the years. In the rear corner sat a rusted cot, its mattress torn open, yellow stuffing spilling out as if someone had violently ripped at it. Above the cot, carved into the wood, were straight lines. 5, then a diagonal slash through them. Dozens of these rows ascended the wall, reaching higher than I could stretch. I did not count them. I had no desire to. The second cabin compelled me to pause the moment I perceived it. Everything was boarded up, windows and door. The entire front was sealed with planks, but the nails were not on the exterior. They had been driven from the inside. This made no logical sense. I circled it once, then a second time. There were no gaps, no tools left behind, no chimney, no firewood, no footprints, except there were footprints in the far corner beneath a boarded window. The dirt was soft. Bootprints were pressed deeply, larger and heavier than my own. They led directly to the door and abruptly ceased. There was no exit trail, no indication of a turnaround. They simply vanished. It was at this point that a sense of unease began to permeate my thoughts. I reassured myself that someone had passed through weeks or perhaps months ago. It could have been a hunter, a squatter, or merely another hiker. Nevertheless, I concluded it was time to move on. I retrieved my map, confirmed my direction, and angled northward. The trail appeared to resume its expected course, so I followed it. I walked for 10 minutes before the situation once again felt wrong. The trail curved sharply and steeply to the left. It should not have. According to my map, it should have continued straight for another half-mile. I adjusted my course, veering right to correct my direction, ascended a slope, pushed through undergrowth, and then stepped into the clearing again. The cabins were present, all 5 of them exactly the same. The same sagging roofs, the same tall grass, the same broken frames. But I had not turned around. I was confident in my orientation. I understood how to interpret terrain. I do not become disoriented in such a manner. This time something else captured my attention. Farther back, obscured by undergrowth, was a 6th cabin. It was smaller, resembling a shed, almost engulfed by greenery. Its door clung to a single hinge. From my vantage point, I could discern the interior. There was a pile of clothing neatly folded, hiking pants, a jacket, socks, and boots that appeared brand new, still stiff and barely worn. On top of these items rested a folded map, identical to my own. I approached cautiously and quietly, then picked it up. It displayed the same route, the same markings, but this particular map had the cabin circled repeatedly in thick red ink. The circles were not printed or neat. They appeared to be drawn from memory, rushed, desperate. I returned the map to its original location. Then I retreated, and then I observed it. Movement behind the slats of the boarded cabin, the one with the sealed door. Something passed across the window, slow, deliberate. Not an animal, not someone pacing nervously. It glided from one boarded window to the next. I held my breath. My chest felt constricted, as if I had forgotten how to breathe. I did not immediately flee. For a brief moment, I remained paralyzed. My body had not yet processed what my brain understood, and then I moved with haste. I did not follow the trail. I descended downhill through brambles and brush. I was indifferent to whether I fell or lacerated my legs. I simply desired to put distance between myself and those cabins. Branches snapped behind me. It could have been anything: wind, squirrels, my own reverberating footsteps. But every crackling sound propelled me faster. I did not glance back. I had no wish to see. Eventually, the forest opened, and my boots made contact with gravel. It was some kind of service road not indicated on the map. I did not halt. I walked until the sun dipped and the air grew cold. I walked until headlights became visible. A delivery truck slowed. I must have presented a distressed appearance, as the driver did not even pose questions. He simply opened the door and allowed me to enter. I did not speak much. I offered no explanations. I kept my map tightly folded in my lap and stared out the window as we traversed miles of trees, and I never returned. Story 8. The Endless Replications of the Tin Cup. I was 34 years old when this event occurred. I can still recall every second of it with vivid clarity, as though it happened only yesterday. It was one of those indeterminate days, late afternoon, the sun commencing its descent, but not yet fully within the golden hour. I was driving along the remote roads in the Appalachian foothills, operating on pure instinct. I had no specific destination. I had not packed, had not consulted the weather forecast, nor had I informed anyone of my whereabouts. I simply felt an overwhelming need to escape. Sometimes that imperative urge surfaces, you understand. A sensation as if one's skin no longer fits correctly, and the sole remedy is movement. I had grown up amidst those hills, 2 counties away, so the roads were not entirely unfamiliar. Once one departed the main highway, one could continue indefinitely if permitted. Old gravel tracks transitioned into dirt paths. They twisted into forgotten trails that had not been charted for decades. These were logging roads, hunting paths, some leading to clearings, others merely dissolving into the surrounding trees. The kind of places one discovers only when seeking nowhere in particular. That is precisely where I ventured. Nowhere in particular. The gravel began to thin after approximately 40 minutes. The road grew rough, comprising just 2 deep ruts carved through the dirt. The trees pressed in closer, leaning forward as though observing my passage. I reduced my speed, not out of fear, but from a primal instinct. It felt as though I was entering a different rhythm of existence. That was when I perceived it. The first cabin. It was situated just off the right side, perhaps 20 or 30 feet back. Easily missed. It was old and gray, appearing as if it had been hewn from the identical trees that encircled it. The wood conveyed a soft, weathered quality, as though pressing a finger into it might cause it to crumble. One corner of the roof sagged downwards like a dismissive shrug. The window frame stood empty. No glass, just a hollow opening staring back. I pulled off the road, shut off the engine, and exited the vehicle. The silence struck first. Not an absolute void of sound. There were birds and a gentle breeze rustling through the leaves, but it was muffled, as if I had stepped into an acoustically insulated version of the world. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I drew nearer. From a distance, it had appeared abandoned. Up close, it still did. Yet something felt amiss. The door was absent. Only the frame remained, but the hinges seemed new. Not gleaming, but clean. Silver, devoid of rust or wear, as though someone had recently replaced them and then simply departed. I paused at the threshold, gazing inward. Then, without conscious decision, I stepped inside. The air was dense and stale. The floor groaned beneath my weight, soft in certain areas, bowed in others. In one corner, a broken chair had collapsed inward, as if it had simply yielded. But what truly compelled me to pause was the cup. A tin cup placed precisely in the center of the floor, upright, devoid of dents or dust, merely sitting there, perfectly clean, perfectly still, as if someone had set it down mere minutes earlier. I crouched closer. It was not in itself remarkable, just plain metal. However, in that particular space, ruined and abandoned, it defied logic. I stood, arms crossed, attempting to convince myself that a hunter had left it, or someone merely passing through. There were numerous plausible explanations. None, however, felt correct. I stepped back outside, brushing my hands on my jeans. It was then that I noticed the second cabin, further down, approximately 30 yards distant, beyond a slight depression in the tree line. Initially, I conjectured that I was merely circling back, that I was observing the same cabin once more. But no, it was too far away. The terrain did not correspond. This was another structure, and it appeared exactly the same. The same gray boards, the same sagging roof, the same empty doorway, the same impossibly clean hinges. My chest tightened as I stepped inside. I was reluctant to, yet I found myself unable to resist. The interior was a duplicate, the same collapsed chair, the same bowed floor, and in the center the same tin cup. By this point, my skin was tingling. I surveyed my surroundings, half expecting someone to emerge. Suddenly, some elaborate prank, some peculiar art installation, something designed specifically to disorient individuals. Up the hill, through brambles, I detected another form, another roof. I ascended. Branches scraped my arms. Thorns snagged my jeans. The incline was not particularly steep, but it felt as though the forest actively resisted my presence. And at the summit, cabin number 3, identical, not merely similar, identical. The same configuration, seemingly pressed into the hill 3 times. Inside, the same broken chair, the same warped floor, the same tin cup. I retreated slowly, my breath shallow. This was not arbitrary, this was not a mere coincidence. I turned, attempting to retrace my path, but everything appeared incorrect. The slope, the trees, even the quality of the sunlight. And down where I believed the road had been, I observed yet another cabin. That was when panic seized me. I bolted downhill, nearly losing my footing. I shouted, a raw sound tearing from my throat. I am unsure what I anticipated. A response, perhaps something human, anything to confirm I was not alone. But the forest absorbed my cry. I reached the next cabin. 4, 5, I could no longer keep count. I entered desperate for any difference, but it was the same. The same chair, the same floor, the same tin cup. I spun around and froze. Dozens of cabins were scattered among the trees, their outlines flickering into view with my movements. Dozens of them, perfect replicas dispersed like seeds. I found myself unable to breathe. I could not recall the direction from which I had come. The forest felt distorted, folded in upon itself until concepts of direction became meaningless. I pressed my hand against a tree, seeking to ground myself. Cool bark damp against my palm, I instructed myself to breathe, to focus, to choose a direction, to walk, to avoid looking at the cabins, to avoid thinking about them. So I did. I kept my gaze fixed forward, disregarding the indistinctness at the periphery of my vision. My legs burned, sweat alternately chilled, returned, and chilled again. The woods stretched into an eternity. I did not cease my movement. And then gravel, real gravel beneath my boots. I looked up. My car, precisely where I had left it. The forest behind me appeared normal. No cabins, just trees. Nothing broken, nothing out of place. I opened the car door and settled into the seat. My hands were uncontrollably shaking. I drove without interruption. I was indifferent to my mobile phone. I did not check for a signal. I simply drove until pavement reappeared, until I saw houses, power lines, other human beings. Story 9. The shifting reality of the cabins. My workday at the survey site concluded earlier than anticipated that day. I consequently found myself with several hours of daylight remaining. Typically, I would have simply returned directly to camp, consumed a meal, and perhaps logged the morning's observations. However, standing there with no immediate obligations, I decided to take advantage of the available time and genuinely explore the vicinity. There existed a ridge trail that intersected the main clearing. It was a path I had passed numerous times but had never truly traversed. It extended eastward, winding down toward an area I usually disregarded because it did not lead to any practical destination. On this occasion, I resolved to ascertain its endpoint. The trail descended into a shallow depression, the kind that feels more like a subtle indentation in the earth than a significant geological feature. It was there that I sighted the cabin. It leaned as if it had been forcefully embedded halfway into the ground, with one wall already swallowed by the soil. The porch steps were entirely absent, eroded away until nothing remained but splinters and soft earth. The roof had collapsed inward toward the center, as if gradually folding upon itself. I paused just within the tree line and observed it intently. I was sufficiently familiar with these woods to be certain that no structures were supposed to remain standing in that location. Perhaps an ancient foundation or some ruins, but not something upright, not something one could actually enter. Yet there it stood, nestled in that hollow, as if patiently awaiting detection. I traversed the clearing and stepped onto the warped boards of what remained of the porch. The door hung askew within its frame, but when I made contact with it, it swung open with disconcerting ease. The interior of the cabin was entirely devoid of contents. No furniture, no tools, no crates, nor any indications that anyone had resided there for decades. The sole remaining feature was a fireplace choked with rubble and ash. Beside it, a broken rocking chair was tipped forward. It was positioned in such a manner that it appeared as though someone had just risen from it. It conveyed a sense less of abandonment and more of being momentarily paused. The floor groaned under my weight. It was the sort of sound that instinctively causes one to shift balance, convinced that the next step will lead directly through the floor. I was unwilling to test its stability. Consequently, I turned to depart. And that was when I noticed another cabin. This one was situated further up the slope, partially concealed between two maple trees, smaller than the first, yet somehow more defined. Its edges appeared unnaturally sharp against the ridge. I blinked, and in that fleeting moment, it vanished. I initially assumed it was merely an issue of perspective, so I shifted to the left, pushing through undergrowth until I could re-establish the view. And there it was, back in its previous location, but closer this time. It was not a subtle change. It was not simply a matter of perspective. The structure had unequivocally moved. My stomach churned, but I nevertheless advanced toward it. The closer I approached, the more intact it appeared. The logs were solid, tightly stacked. The roof was firm and properly angled. The door was loose but upright. It did not convey an impression of abandonment. It appeared lived in. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. 2 beds occupied the far wall, perfectly made with handmade quilts, not dusty or faded but fresh, as if someone had just arranged them that very morning. At the foot of the bed stood a dresser. Its surface was bare save for a neatly folded stack of clothes. I extended my hand to touch the top shirt, anticipating it to disintegrate like old paper. Instead, it was warm. Not merely warm, but drier warm, as if someone had just removed it from a machine minutes earlier. I recoiled my hand abruptly. The oppressive weight of the room pressed in on me. My skin tingled, my arms stiffened. Every fiber of my being urged me to leave. I stepped back outside into the clearing again, and that was when I froze. Across the way was the first cabin, the collapsed one. Only now it was not collapsed at all. The walls stood erect. The roof was whole. The porch was solid and level. Thin smoke curled languidly from the chimney. I stumbled backward, steadying myself against the doorway of the second cabin. I turned my head merely to ascertain if it still retained its former appearance, and my stomach plummeted. The 2 beds were gone. The quilts, the dresser, everything had vanished. What remained was a stripped, rotting wooden frame that utterly broke my composure. I ran. I tore down the slope. Branches clawed at my arms. Loose soil caused my boots to slide. My chest ached with every breath, but I dared not stop. The forest felt profoundly wrong as I pushed through it, as if the ridge itself was distorting into configurations it had never before possessed. Paths looped where they should not have. Clearings seamlessly merged into one another. I was intimately familiar with these woods, yet every step felt as though I was sinking deeper into a place that was utterly alien. I continued running until the trees thinned and gravel crunched beneath my boots. I dropped to my knees on the road, gasping, my arms trembling beneath me. When I finally compelled myself to look back, I anticipated at least some trace. A roofline, a chimney, a solitary column of smoke ascending above the treetops. There was nothing.